Welcome to episode 3 of our podcast, the Global Black History Podcast. This is going to be part 3 of my 4-part series on the genocide in the Belgian Congo. If this is interesting to you, I highly recommend checking out part 1 and 2 because this will provide valuable context that you will definitely need to understand some of the content we are going to be talking about today. We're going to get right into it, and we left off in part 2 with our whistleblower, George Washington Williams, an African-American historian who was the person blowing the whistle on King Leopold II and writing an open letter to the king pleading Leopold to take a closer look at the horrors he witnessed in the Belgian Congo. Williams, perhaps predicting that nothing would come of this letter if he sent it exclusively to the king, had it printed and distributed widely throughout Europe and the United States as a pamphlet. The Herald, the newspaper that had formerly employed Stanley and had previously sent Stanley to Africa, published the letter, and this infuriated both Stanley and Leopold II, so they began a smear campaign of Williams. Stanley referred to the letter as blackmail, and Leopold II accused Williams of lying. It's unclear what they believed would have motivated Williams to lie, but in their press attack of George Washington Williams, they attacked his military career as a colonel, and yes, they even launched a more racially charged attack against him, where Leopold referred to him as an unbalanced Negro. Unfortunately, as this carried on, Williams fell ill with tuberculosis, and he'd run out of money for treatment. As he focused on his recovery and seeking money for treatment, he didn't have the strength to fight these accusations with all the strength he might have at his prime. He passed away in 1891, where several Belgian newspapers noted his death with satisfaction. Because, he was talking about their king and their king's project in this negative manner, and they generally believed him to be a troublemaker and a rabble-rouser, and of course, they didn't like that, they felt like a black man was speaking out of turn. Williams wasn't the only journalist, however, who visited the Congo and felt horrified at what he witnessed. An English missionary named George Grenfell privately corroborated Williams' story, but he expressed a fear of defying the Belgian state. Williams, a man of unique bravery at least when it came to these human rights abuses, unfortunately died with his name dragged through the mud, and he never lived to defend himself properly. He didn't even have a gravestone when he passed away, until a future historian took it upon himself to honor Williams' memory. So now that we're here, we found out what unfortunately happened to our whistleblower, we're going to go back to the Congo and dive into what was going on there. As I mentioned in part 2, this is the episode where we're going to get into more of the meat of the human rights abuses and some of the violence. So in the Congo, there was a governor general who held the title of being the sole ruler over the territory. However, his power was more limited than you might expect. The governor general was based out of Boma, and throughout the Congo, there were officials at all the posts and river stations as they carved their way into the interior. Effectively, the Belgians destroyed the political power of the African chiefs and installed these white officials who became mini dictators over the different territories that Leopold, or the governor general, set them in charge of. Most of these men were single, and most of them engaged in the rape of African sex slaves, pseudonymically referred to as concubines in a lot of the writings about this time period, but I really prefer not to sugarcoat what they did. Royal decrees from Belgium established all the governance in the Congo. Leopold's company couldn't cut through to the interior without help, so he allowed private companies to come into the Congo region and extract resources for themselves, and Leopold would then extract a 50% cut from everything that they made. All of these private companies, as well as Leopold's personal holdings, utilized slave labor exclusively. Africans were forbidden from using money throughout the area, and they were also forbidden from doing elephant trade with anyone who wasn't directly tied to Leopold. So there was a trade monopoly, as we talked about in parts 1 and 2, and this meant that nobody else could trade without some money passing in Leopold's hands. Leopold, as we remember, ordered his people to collect all the ivory they could find. By the Belgian king's order, they were to kill every elephant and extract as much ivory as possible. Agents who brought ivory to the top dogs in the colony received a 6% commission, which provided high incentive for them to capture, torture, and force Africans to collect as much ivory as possible. They also forced them to accept the lowest price possible for the ivory, and Belgian agents often did this at gunpoint. Many of us may be familiar with the controversial practice of using child soldiers, or kadogo, in the Congo Civil War, the more recent civil war. And it is interesting to note that you can trace this history of child labor and exposure to high amounts of violence to the Belgian Congo, where the Belgians also forced children to work because of orders essentially not to let any source of labor go to waste. During the 1890s ivory rush, illness and death skyrocketed, and we have accounts of the torture methods and enslavement the Congo peoples experienced. I'm going to read a quote to give you a clear picture of some of the torture and exploitation firsthand. These were the words of a Belgian senator named Edmond Picard, who wrote this after a visit to the Congo in 1896. Unceasingly, we met these porters, black, miserable, with only a horribly filthy loincloth for clothing, frizzy and bareheaded, supporting the load, box, bale, ivory tusk, barrel, most of them sickly, drooping under a burden increased by tiredness and insufficient food. A handful of rice and some stinking dried fish. Pitiful walking caryatids, beasts of burden with thin monkey legs, with drawn features, eyes fixed and round from preoccupation with keeping their balance and from the days of exhaustion. They come and go like this by the thousands, requisitioned by the state armed with its powerful militia, handed over by chiefs whose slaves they are and who make off with their salaries, trotting with bent knees, belly forward, an arm raised to steady the load, the other leaning on a long walking stick, dusty and sweaty. Insects spreading out across the mountains and valleys, their many files and their task of Sisyphus, dying along the road or, the journey over, heading off to die from overwork in their villages. In this account, we will get to sort of the criteria for determining genocidal deaths in part 4, but we are going to revisit some of these details later. I want to point out the starvation, exhaustion, the mention of illness, as well as the thousands, the sheer number of people that he witnessed. This is one of the first accounts for this episode that we've gone into. However, there will be many more accounts similar to this one. Every morning in Leopoldville, visitors awoke to the sound of screams, as overseers beat children with a weapon known as a chikat. A chikat is a whip of sun-dried hippopotamus hide cut into a long, sharp-edged corkscrew strip. So we're getting into another graphic part here, so be warned. Blows from this weapon leave permanent scars. 25 strokes would be enough to render someone unconscious, and 100 or more strokes were fatal. An order of 100 lashes or more was not an uncommon punishment, and this happened typically. In the mornings, around 30 or so children, all 7 or 8 years old, would line up and Belgian overseers would hit them with this weapon. As they waited for their turn, they shook with fear, and some of them were so scared that additional white people were required to hold them down for their beatings. This scene was witnessed multiple times, or this type of scene, by different people. One of the reasons cited for this type of punishment was that the children had laughed in the presence of a white man. Stanislas Lefrance, a second whistleblower on the scene and a Belgian prosecutor at the time, began writing about what he witnessed, which had the effect of the Belgians immediately labeling him as a troublemaker. However, his publications in Belgian newspapers didn't get much of a reaction from the Belgian public. It was a mixture of disbelief or being unable to grasp the horror. But here is another excerpt from Lefranc's writing. The station chief selects the victims. Trembling, haggard, they lie face down on the ground. 2 of their companions, sometimes 4, seize them by the feet and hands and remove their cotton drawers. Each time that the torturer lifts up the chicotte, a reddish stripe appears on the skin of the pitiful victims, who, however firmly held, gasp in frightful contortions. At the first blows, the unhappy victims let out horrible cries, which soon become faint groans. In a refinement of evil, some officers, and I've witnessed this, demand that when the sufferer gets up, panting, he must graciously give the military salute. Now, when it comes to the widespread chicotte use, there's another interesting parallel to other genocides, various crimes against humanity that we've seen throughout history. And that is that many Europeans found the chicotte distasteful for them to personally use, but they were beyond happy to create a class of African foremen to take over the job. The author of King Leopold's Ghost, Adam Hochschild, likened this to the kapos in the Nazi concentration camps and the praderki or trustees in the Soviet gulags. Hochschild wrote in his book, just as terrorizing people is part of conquest, so is forcing someone else to administer the terror. So a part of this entire colonial project was normalizing terror and making it a point of pride amongst European administrators to withstand horrors that might have disgusted them otherwise. We see this as well with SS soldiers in Nazi killing fields and, let's say, various military operations that may be ongoing, carried out by certain countries. People who once found murder distasteful can get used to it, and they can even take pride in what they're doing, unfortunately. In Europe, while these horrors were going on, Leopold continued to draw attention for grandly issuing edicts against slavery. But while he did that, he continued to exploit slave labor in the Congo, and the officials spoke euphemistically about their enormous trade in human cargo. So here we see a system of race-based enslavement that was not the transatlantic slave trade, right? Because no one crossed the Middle Passage. Yet, to me, it seems rather unfair to compare this to the transatlantic slave trade and to say that people who went through this, quote, had it better. Now, I'm not saying that you can say it was worse either, but I just personally choose a different hill to die on than worse slavery Olympics, let's just say. But if you can clearly see that the transatlantic slave trade left former slaves with no special privilege due to their racial background in America, you can hopefully empathize with the story that we're talking about on the podcast today. So let's talk about how the slave trade functioned and some of the euphemisms commonly used. The force publique, which was effectively the military police established in the Congo by Belgium, paid white officials 25 francs per every healthy adult male that they recruited. So some of these men were bought from chiefs and some kidnapped. Now, I want to again address the chiefs selling slaves part. We know from all previous accounts that Belgians forced chiefs to do all kinds of things at gunpoint, including handing over all of their territory for cloth or gin. So is it a stretch to suspect that the heavy demand for human laborers might have been carried out at gunpoint as well? In my opinion, this is not a stretch. However, this was not explicitly stated in any of my research. It's sort of a suggestion to what my mind is open to. Considering historical writing, especially on genocides, and especially when most of this documentation is, for lack of a better word, from the side that won, a lot of this writing tends to sugarcoat European violence. And so I really just want to keep an open, skeptical mind to these sorts of claims. And this is specifically my opinion, obviously not fact. Belgian officials even worked with Arab slave traders in the region, which if you've listened to part 1 and 2, you will find ironic, considering all of European culture had united hypocritically to condemn the viciousness of Arab slavery. But this connection to Arab slave trade started the initial whispering amongst European society about what the heck Leopold was getting up to in the Congo. Leopold formed a relationship with a renowned Arab slaver based out of Zanzibar named Hamed bin Mohammed el Murjebi, known as Tipu Tip. Tipu Tip made a fortune in ivory and slave trade on his own, which impressed King Leopold. So King Leopold takes Tipu Tip and makes him the de facto leader of Eastern Congo. He became the governor of the Stanley Falls province in the east and installed several family members in positions under him. Needless to say, this was corrupt, but he was a slaver, so I hope that was clear. Leopold agreed to buy the freedom of several thousand of Tipu Tip's slaves. But this freedom came with a major caveat. They'd be forced to work for 7 years as slaves in the force publique. So very bizarre notions of what freedom is from Leopold. Eventually, Leopold II and Tipu Tip parted ways, but not after raising some red flags in Europe. Another interesting reason I bring this up is because the mythology of European involvement in Africa, especially when it comes to the Arab slave trade, portrays the Europeans as heroes who fought ardently against Arab viciousness in Africa. However, it's quite clear that when convenient, Belgians happily worked alongside Arab slavers to suit their collaborative agendas. I spoke briefly about children in the colonies, but I wanted to get some more instances of child abuse and exploitation because I think it's important to contextualize some of the cruelty we're talking about. And I also want to remind you of how recently the 1890s was, and we will see how recently how this genocide has ties to the much more contemporary era. So let's talk the 1890s, okay? So my great-grandmother died a couple years ago at 96 years old, and I believe she was born in 1926 or 1925. I don't remember specifically, but one of those 2 years. That means when she was growing up, she would have known people who were alive in the 1890s, which means that most of us can probably directly trace our ancestry to the 1890s, because for me, it's 1, 2, 3, it's maybe 3.5 generations back. Her parents were probably born in that time period. So that's not very far. And many of us might even be able to name ancestors from that specific time. So just something to think about when you're trying to think about, okay, when did this all happen? I'm not asking you to think about 1492. I'm asking you to think of the turn of the century. When the New York Times or the Washington Post runs stories about jungle savages using child soldiers and giving them methamphetamines, etc., I just want us to draw these historical connections to what went on in the Congo with children there, especially because a lot of the instances of child soldiers do come out of the modern-day Democratic Republic of Congo. And I want us to ask ourselves if there's more to history than perhaps what fits within the scope of their articles. And I also want to question what motivations might underpin not presenting the history of certain practices that media might want us to view as indigenous to the region. So in the Congo, Leopold had a specific agenda for Black children. This was a man filled with bright ideas. He wanted to train children for an army. He arranged to set up 3 colonies with the express purpose of raising an army of children. Those are his explicit words and intentions. So who better to fight in your army than kids, I guess? So prior to Belgian interference, there was no concept of being an orphan. Yet, creating this class of orphans by murdering parents, destroying clan and extended family ties, allowed Leopold to manufacture the image that what he did was for the good of African society. He used the clergy to assist in this particular project and heavily subsidized the Catholic Church, an institution with a long history of signing off on various crimes against humanity. The Catholics forced conversions, or, quote, taught Christianity, depending on your perspective, and assisted in Leopold raising an army of child soldiers to assist his conquest. The only state-funded schools in the Congo were these Christian military academies, ruled by Irons and the Chikat. There's just so much to say about this specific piece of information, but I'll let you sit with it for a little while. Maybe I may do another episode in the future, just kind of talking about all the different, highlights from this specific series. Girls might not have been trained to be soldiers, but they were also separated from their families and converted to Catholicism, and they were in similar schools, just not with the purpose of becoming soldiers. I don't even want to know what the purpose was, because if it was written down, it was probably destroyed. But, we know what happens to women in times of genocide, and it's not good. So this nun who ran one of these schools had a touching quote that I wanted to read for you now. Several of the little girls were so sickly on their arrival, our good sisters couldn't save them. But all had the happiness of receiving holy baptism. They are now little angels in heaven who are praying for our great king. So I am sure they were absolutely not praying for King Leopold II. But what do I know, right? What do I know? It's just so hard to read this stuff without getting livid. It's difficult. And I mean, it is genocide. So if you're not getting mad, are you okay? Like, is everything okay at home? I talked so much about Stanley in previous episodes because he was sort of one of the people who set the tone, set the culture, established the colony, established the vibes. But he began to fade from the scene a bit because he returned to England. He got married, and he was sickened by too much malaria. And he had also written several bestsellers about Africa, and he'd solidified his position within canonic British history as a hero and an explorer. As I mentioned before, the mainstream articles on Stanley paint a very different picture of him than facts. And this is all thanks to his hard work as a propagandist. Another explorer took his place, as in becoming one of the premier explorers and writers on Africa. And this man was not well known because this explorer was another Black American, a Christian named William Shepherd, who went to Africa as part of a fact-finding mission for a U.S. white supremacist Send Them Back to Africa campaign, which had been gaining traction. Now, Shepherd didn't go because he was a white supremacist himself. He went because that was the only way that he could go. And he couldn't even go to Africa right away because the U.S. government would not allow him to travel without a white man. He had his own religious reasons for going, which involved a dream of converting Africans to Christianity, which, I have my own thoughts on that, which I'll leave out of this episode. And he also wanted to stake out a potential settlement for Black Americans where they could live free of segregation. Shepherd was an evangelist through and through, and he established a Presbyterian mission in the Congo. He even crossed paths with Joseph Conrad, who he unsuccessfully attempted to convert. Shepherd became very popular in the Congo, and he learned the language of the Bakuba, and he was the only person there who bothered to learn the native language, a theme that we run across time and time again in this story. Shepherd was in complete awe of the Kuba people, especially their art, specifically masks, sculptures, and elaborately carved tools. He brought back a lot of art from his mission to Virginia, where much of it remains to this day at a university in Southern Virginia. I did not write down the name. The Kuba, due to their difficult to access civilization in the interior of the country, had avoided much of the destruction of slavers, and Shepherd became the first outsider to reach the capital. Because he was Black, and he came dressed in white clothes, like the white men that they had heard about. At first they were distrustful of him, but eventually they formed this mythology about him that he was a returned ancestor, which, given the history of sort of like the Black American people in relation to West Africans, has kind of like a level of beauty to it, in my opinion. Shepherd did have some judgments of the Kuba people. He didn't like that they burned women as witches, fair take, or that they occasionally partook in human sacrifice. That one I'm more neutral on. Now, probably a good take. Probably don't do that. But he proved to be a more balanced writer than Stanley and wrote positively about their civilization, so the civilization of the Kuba. Shepard wrote about the Bakuba in detail, and I'm going to read another excerpt because I kind of like what he said. I grew very fond of the Bakuba, he writes. They were the finest looking race I had seen in Africa. Dignified, graceful, courageous, honest, with an open, smiling countenance, and really hospitable. Their knowledge of weaving, embroidery, wood carving, and smelting was the highest in equatorial Africa. He really got to know these people. He wrote so much about them, and he had such great admiration for them. The Kuba people were mostly non-violent, but eventually, after the rubber boom started, which we'll get to, they eventually did have to mount a resistance against the Belgians, but unfortunately they were exterminated by the Belgians, or at least decimated by the Belgians. When Shepard returned to the United States, he received many accolades, but those accolades were always punctuated by a parenthetical C to denote that he was colored. In Africa, he hadn't been a second-class citizen, and he always looked back on his time there fondly. He even named his son after the Kuba king. Unfortunately, as I hinted at before, 8 years after Shepard's visit, the Belgians reached and looted the Kuba capital, more or less destroying everything. Another major market force triggered this event, them reaching the interior, and the subsequent nightmare that would follow. A breakthrough in rubber manufacturing that occurred when Charles Goodyear spilled sulfur onto hot rubber and ignited the rubber boom of the 1890s. Wild rubber soon surpassed ivory as the hottest commodity on the markets. While ivory could still be profitable, harvesting wild rubber became Leopold II's next plan to get out of the debt he'd gone into carving his way up from the Congo River basin for all those years. Since cultivated rubber, which most other people trying to get in on rubber would have relied on, takes a while to mature, Leopold figured he'd have to act fast before plantations in South and Latin America came to fruition. So he sent furious telegrams back and forth to Congo outposts obsessing over commodity prices and how much rubber he needed to be the top dog. King Leopold had a 2-decade rubber monopoly built on slave labor that eventually led to the deaths of approximately 10 million people. Between 1890 and 1904, total Congo rubber earnings increased 96 times over. By the turn of the century, the Congo had become far and away the most profitable colony in Africa. Collecting rubber is notoriously dangerous work, and it's honestly high-key trash. The old methods of capturing slaves simply wouldn't work because nobody wanted to do this job. So Belgians devised a new method of extracting profits. They'd burn villages, take food, and kidnap women, and demand villagers meet rubber quotas by the kilogram that would basically take all day long to meet. Once those quotas were met, usually around 4 kilos of rubber per adult male per fortnight, they could have their women returned for 1 to 2 goats apiece in exchange for the women. Which, if you know anything about goats, would have also been expensive and detrimental to the maintenance of society after experiencing this sort of violent raid in the first place. This also meant that the primary labor force for different societies would have been working full-time gathering rubber and would have disrupted husbandry, agriculture, and basic societal function. You couldn't have families. You couldn't have loved ones, really. Everyone you knew would be killed. I'd hate to imagine what sort of sexual violence women went through while they were captured. But this was, truly horrible. One of the Belgian manuals documents this process specifically. In Africa, taking prisoners is an easy thing to do. For if the natives hide, they will not go far from their village and must come to look for food in the gardens which surround it. In watching these carefully, you will be certain of capturing people after a brief delay. When you feel you have enough captives, you should choose among them an old person, preferably an old woman. Make her a present and send her to her chief to begin negotiations. The chief, wanting to see his people set free, will usually decide to send representatives. Really nauseating. During this time, the entire area was essentially under martial law by the force publique. In 1899, in one instance, Shepard, before returning to America, was forced to go to one of these rubber outposts in the bush, where the stench of burning and rotting flesh met him in the distance. Upon drawing closer, Shepard saw a spit roast of human hands, severed hands, hovering over the fire, where he counted 81 hands total that Belgian officials had severed from various individuals. The officials claimed they had to cut off the right hands to show the state how many they killed. They smoked the hands over the fire to preserve them. They also cut off hands, noses, and ears to coerce labor out of different groups and to maintain a reign of terror over the populace. Leopold II used the profits he extracted from this rubber regime to build several arches and monuments throughout Belgium, as well as some expansions to his personal property, which we will detail later. We're going to do a couple more excerpts now because this is how we get, this is the tough stuff, right? This quote describes the particular terrors of a state official, Léon Févier. All the blacks saw this man as the devil of the equator. From all the bodies killed in the field, you had to cut off the hands. He wanted to see the number of hands cut off by each soldier, who had to bring them in baskets. A village which refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean. As a young man, I saw Févier's soldier, Molili, then guarding the village of Boyeka, take a big net, put 10 arrested natives in it, attach stones to the net, and make it tumble into the river. Rubber caused these torments. That's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. Soldiers made young men kill or rape their own mothers and sisters. So this is another whistleblower describing some of the terrors. This is another excerpt here. The station chief at Mobima used his revolver to shoot holes in Africans' earlobes. Raoul de Premorel, an agent working along the Kasai River, enjoyed giving large doses of castor oil to people he considered malingerers. When villagers, in a desperate attempt to meet the weight quota, turned in rubber mixed with dirt or pebbles to the agent Albéric d'Etiage, he made them eat it. When 2 porters failed to use a designated latrine, a district commissioner, Jean Dussin, ordered them paraded in front of troops, their faces rubbed with excrement. As news of the white man's soldiers and their baskets of severed hands spread throughout Congo, a myth gained credence with Africans that was a curious reversal of the white obsession with black cannibalism. They said that the cans of corned beef seen in white men's houses did not contain meat from the animals shown on the label, but they contained chopped up hands. And we can see how they came to that conclusion. So I'm going to talk for just 1 second, go off script just a little, because I don't actually detail this very much in any episode. And this is the black resistance to this. Was there strong black resistance to this? Yes. However, there was already a fractured society, fractured societies when this began. And this was such a fracturing of society that mounted resistance was put down pretty effectively. However, there was continuous resistance throughout this. People didn't just sit around and, I don't know what to do, guess I'm a slave. No, that's not what happened. They fought back whenever they could, relentlessly, time and time again, resistance after resistance. However, the reason I didn't talk about it too much in this podcast is because there wasn't much of an effect that this had on ending this genocide. And I wanted to kind of fixate more on a timeline that focused more on, the beginning, middle, and end of the genocide. So hopefully that, answers any lingering questions you may have had about that. The Congo state didn't publish a budget and vastly underreported its profits to the government of Belgium. Additionally, King Leopold used the existence of his own personal country to issue bonds which he handed out to favorites and effectively used to commit what we'd refer to today as fraud. He utilized these bonds to pay for public works in Belgium, allowing the Belgian people to benefit from this horrible, decades-long practice of slave labor and murder. He built a string of monuments, new palace wings, museums, and pavilions, and those began going up all over Belgium. At his favorite seaside resort, Ostend, Leopold spent millions of francs building a promenade, several parks, and he also built a turreted gallery for the racetrack he frequented. Money from rubber theft financed a golf course, a royal chalet at, Raversiged, and endless renovations and the enlargement of the Chateau of Lequin. Many of these riches Leopold officially gave to his country with much fanfare as a royal gift, although he basically maintained his same lifestyle. The reason he gave this money and these works as a royal gift were to have the nation basically pay for the upkeep of these properties and keep them out of the hand of his 3 daughters from his marriage to Louise, which did eventually break down, and he also hated his daughters a lot. But this isn't a story of Leopold's personal life, so I didn't detail some of the hot and spicy stuff from that. Horrors upon horrors occurred in the Congo, and since George Washington Williams, no one dared to really speak out again. Few of the people who had participated in atrocities in the Congo came home and talked about it, and they all followed Leopold's propaganda line once they returned. But one man would unleash a torrent of criticism against Leopold, which would eventually lead to the discovery of the depth of depravity Leopold unleashed on Africa. E.D. Morel, an Irishman, happened to have a great skill for publicizing his message, and in part 4 of this series, because we're almost done with this podcast, we will talk about how this all came falling down around King Leopold after decades of exploitation, looting, theft, and fraud. Now, I want to end this episode by lingering on another interesting tidbit, which is the fact that Leopold had never actually been to the Congo. He knew what was happening down there, and he chose to ignore it. So he wasn't ignorant because he never visited. He never visited because he wanted to maintain plausible deniability. He was a sneaky man, sneaky little man. That's why I mentioned that in earlier episodes. Sneaky little man. He did this to maintain the illusion of his innocence in case anything happened. He knew what was happening, and all of the obfuscation wasn't the antics of a bumbling idiot, but a man carefully plotting a way to avoid accountability for his actions, and it high-key worked. It is not possible for someone to stumble into committing a genocide. Let's just, not my opinion, I'm sorry, but I'm just gonna say this is a fact. If you disagree with this fact, then I don't know what to tell you. It's just a fact. Leopold ordered a genocide, and he methodically had his people carry out the large-scale plunder of an entire people. We will get into the technical definition of genocide and why I still say that he methodically ordered this out in the next episode. And so on that super positive, upbeat, light, and fluffy note, this is all I have for you in this episode today. Follow the podcast, subscribe, because this deep dive is about to get deeper. And I think today touched on some of the reasons anyone might want to listen to a podcast on this subject. This is the meat of what you really wanted to know about this. Let's be real. We want to know, what did they do? You know, oh, it was a genocide. Well, who they killed, how they killed them, right? I'm sorry, but that's just kind of how our brains work. That's what we want to know. In the next episode, we're going to do the takedown, King Leopold's last gasp. And I won't leave you hanging without how exactly researchers came to this 10 million people estimate. And we're going to talk about the cover-up and why we don't know anything about this today. And in writing that episode, the cover-up is so devastatingly simple that I almost felt like, it's not like I'm going to have to peel back layers. There's just one really disgusting layer, and I will be peeling that back in the next one. So I will see you in the next one. And I do now have a Patreon. You can chip in to buy me a cup of coffee to fuel my research sessions. And that is at www.patreon.com/blackhistorypod. I will put that in the description of this podcast. so you can come and subscribe and get some behind the scenes goodness when I finally put that together, or buy me a coffee out of the goodness of your heart before I put it together. So I will see you in the next one, and you'll hear from me soon. Bye.